The moment Nora Rhodes rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was riding hard and alone, and her left arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. She pulled her roan mare to a stop outside the Caldwell General Store, swayed once in the saddle, and then gripped the pommel with her good hand like she was daring the earth to knock her down. She had dark brown hair that had mostly escaped its braid during whatever ordeal had brought her here, and her green eyes swept the street with the kind of cool, calculating look that told anyone watching she was taking inventory of everything and everyone at once. Her dress had once been practical traveling blue cotton, but dust and dry blood had turned it the color of old rust in places. Perry Trask was standing outside the livery stable when she rode in, his boot propped on the lower rail of the hitching post, a piece of straw turning slowly between his fingers. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had built things with their hands since boyhood, with dark hair that curled at the collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 days. He had lived in Caldwell for 2 years and had never particularly expected anything to change the rhythm of his days. He ran a modest cattle operation southeast of town with his partner, an older man named Caleb Dunn, who handled the accounts while Perry handled everything else. It was a good, steady life, and Perry had decided some months back that steady was exactly what he wanted. He watched the woman on the roan mare scan the street, watched the way her fingers gripped that saddle horn, and then without thinking about it at all, he dropped the piece of straw and walked toward her. "You need a doctor," he said. She looked down at him from the saddle. Up close her eyes were the color of creek water running over green stone, and they were sharp as broken glass. "I know that," she said. "I also need someone to tell me where the sheriff's office is. Doc Harlan is 2 doors down from the sheriff." "You want me to walk with you?" She studied him for a moment. She had the look of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust quickly. "I can manage," she said. "I don't doubt that," Perry said. "But your arm is bleeding through that bandage, and your horse has thrown a shoe on the left rear, and you look like you have not slept in a day and a half. I'm not offering to carry you. I'm offering to walk alongside so you don't have to navigate strange streets alone." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't softness exactly, more like a slight lowering of the guard, the way a door opens just a crack to see who is knocking. "All right," she said. She dismounted without his help, which he had expected. She tied the mare at the hitching post with practiced efficiency, even with one arm, which he had not quite expected. Then she walked with him down the boardwalk toward Doc Harlan's office, and she did not wobble, which impressed him more than anything else she had done. Her name, she told him in the brief walk between buildings, was Nora Rhodes. She had been traveling from Wichita. She had been set upon by 2 road agents 2 days east of Caldwell. She had fought them off with a Colt revolver that she had pulled from her saddle bag, and one of them had winged her in the left arm before they ran. She had ridden the rest of the way to Caldwell because Caldwell was the nearest town and she had kin here, or had had kin here. A cousin named Francis who had written her 6 months ago asking her to come west. Perry held the door to Doc Harlan's office open for her. "Francis Dutton?" he asked. "Francis used to be at the Dutton boarding house out on Maple Street." Nora looked at him quickly. "You know her." He wished in that moment he had a better way to say what he had to say. "Francis passed last winter," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Fever. I'm sorry." Nora stood very still in the doorway for a moment. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, slow and deliberate, like she was filing the information away in a place where she could grieve it properly when she was not standing in a stranger's doorway with a bullet-grazed arm. "I see," she said quietly. Then she walked inside. Doc Harlan was a compact man in his 50s with a white mustache and quick, capable hands. He unwound the bandage, cleaned the wound, and declared it a graze that had dug a shallow furrow along the outer edge of Nora's upper arm, deep enough to bleed badly, not deep enough to cause lasting damage. He stitched it, wrapped it fresh, told her to keep it clean and dry, and charged her $2. Perry waited outside on the bench. He was not sure why he waited. He told himself it was because she was a stranger in town with no kin and no obvious place to go, and Caldwell was, for all its recent civilizing, still a rough cattle town at the end of the Kishom Trail, where a woman alone was not automatically safe. He told himself it was basic decency. When she came out, she looked marginally better. The color had come back slightly to her face, and she carried herself with that same iron posture. She stopped when she saw him still sitting there. "You waited," she said. "Figured you might need someone to show you the hotel. I might not have the funds for a hotel. The Caldwell Hotel is not expensive, and if it's a matter of immediate difficulty, Mrs. Patterson, who runs it, takes payment in credit against work. She's always looking for help in the kitchen." Nora looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was falling golden and warm across the street, and it caught the copper tones in her dark hair. "Why are you being this kind?" she asked directly. It was not a suspicious question exactly. It was the question of a woman who had learned to ask it. Perry considered her. "Because you rode 2 days alone after being shot," he said, "and you didn't once ask anyone to feel sorry for you. That seems to me like someone worth being decent to." She held his gaze. Then something that was almost a smile moved at the edge of her mouth and disappeared. "Nora Rhodes," she said, extending her right hand. He shook it. "Perry Trask." Mrs. Patterson at the Caldwell Hotel was a wide, warm woman who took one look at Nora and immediately sat her down at the kitchen table with a bowl of beef stew and a wedge of cornbread before any conversation about room rates was attempted. Perry introduced them and then excused himself because he had cattle that needed checking before dark, and because something told him that staying any longer was beginning to tip from decent into something else he was not yet ready to examine. He rode out to his spread that evening thinking about green eyes and a set jaw and the particular kind of strength that shows itself not in loudness, but in the refusal to be diminished. The next morning he rode back into town for no reason he could clearly defend to himself. He told Caleb he needed to pick up feed, which was not entirely untrue. He found Nora in the yard behind the hotel, hanging laundry with her good arm, her injured arm held slightly away from her body. She had clearly already negotiated her arrangement with Mrs. Patterson. Her hair was braided neatly, and she had changed into a clean gray dress that fit her better than the traveling one had, and she moved around the yard with a brisk, purposeful energy that made him feel oddly cheerful just watching it. "How is the arm?" he asked from the gate. She looked up without surprise, which suggested she had heard him coming, which suggested she was more alert than most people gave her credit for. "Stiff," she said, "but functional. I am told I can expect full use within 2 weeks if I keep it clean." "Good." He stood at the gate, hat in his hands. "I was wondering if you had been to the sheriff yet, about the road agents." "This morning, first thing." Sheriff Briggs seemed reasonably competent. "He's sending word to the marshal's office in Wichita." She paused in her work and turned to face him. "You came back to check on that." "Partly," he admitted. She waited. "And partly I thought you might want someone to show you around town, since you came here to make a life and the person who was going to help you do that is gone." He said it plainly, without false brightness. Nora looked at the laundry in her hands. Something moved across her face that was grief, real and clean and not hidden, and then she folded the sheet with care and set it in the basket. "Frances and I were close," she said. "We were more like sisters than cousins. I grew up in Missouri. My father died 3 years ago and my mother 2 years after that, and Frances was the only family I had left. She wrote to me every month. She wrote that Caldwell was rough but real, and that a woman with good sense and a willingness to work could make herself something here." She was quiet for a moment. "I sold everything I had in Wichita to make this trip." "So you have nothing to go back to," Perry said, not harshly, just factually. "Correct," Nora said just as factually, "which means I need to build something here." "What did you do in Wichita?" "I kept books for a dry goods merchant. Before that I taught school for 2 years. Perry turned his hat in his hands. "Have you met Tom Ellery yet?" He runs the dry goods store here 2 buildings east of the general store. He's been complaining since January that his accounts are a disaster since his son left for Denver. Something lit in Nora's eyes, not gratitude exactly, interest, the sharp, quick interest of someone seeing a possibility take shape. "No," she said, "I have not met Tom Ellery." "Come on then," Perry said. "I'll introduce you." And so it was that Perry Trask, who had come into town for cattle feed that he did not urgently need, spent the better part of the morning walking Nora Rhodes around Caldwell, introducing her to the merchants and residents who formed the daily fabric of the place. And by early afternoon, Nora had shaken hands with Tom Ellery and agreed to come in the following morning to look at his accounts. And Mrs. Patterson had confirmed that she could stay in the hotel for board and a small wage in exchange for help in the kitchen and laundry. And Caldwell, which had been a strange and lonely destination when she arrived, had taken on the outlines of a possible home. Perry helped her carry the laundry basket back to the hotel kitchen, and at the door she turned and said, with that almost smile that was becoming familiar to him, "Thank you, Perry Trask. You are unexpected." He rode back to his spread in the afternoon with the particular warm confusion of a man who has encountered something that has rearranged the furniture of his interior life and is not quite sure yet how he feels about the new configuration. Caleb Dunn, who was 63 and had been married twice and widowed twice and considered himself something of a scholar of human nature, watched Perry come in, unsaddle his horse with unnecessary thoroughness, and then stand in the barn for a full minute doing nothing at all. "Who is she?" Caleb said without looking up from his ledger. "What? The woman, who is she?" Perry looked at the older man for a moment. "Her name is Nora Rhodes," he said. "She is a stranger who needed orienting. That is all." Caleb wrote something in his ledger. "Of course it is," he said. The weeks that followed had a shape to them that Perry had not planned and would not have been able to describe in straightforward terms to anyone who asked. He was in town 2 or 3 times a week for legitimate ranching reasons, supplies and the stockyards and the hardware store, and each time he was in town, he found reasons to stop at the hotel or at Ellery's Dry Goods, where Nora now sat at a small desk near the window between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, rebuilding Tom Ellery's account books with the focused precision of someone who found genuine satisfaction in bringing order out of numerical chaos. She was good at it. Tom Ellery, a round-faced, good-natured man of 50 who preferred the company of his livestock to his ledgers, told Perry one afternoon in a tone of genuine wonder that Nora had found 3 accounting errors in his first week that had been quietly costing him money for over a year. "She saved me more in the first week than I'm paying her in a month," he said. "That woman is a marvel." Perry agreed, but he said it only to himself. What he said to Nora, when he stopped at the window where the light came through and fell across her careful handwriting, was simpler things. He asked about the accounts, knowing enough about the cattle business to follow her explanations. He told her about the ranch, about the way the spring grass was coming in on the southeast pasture, and the new calf that had arrived that week, and the ongoing negotiation with a buyer in Abilene about a fall sale. She listened to these things with genuine attention, asking questions that were specific and intelligent, and he realized fairly early that what he liked best about talking with her was that she treated every conversation as a serious exchange between 2 people who were both worth listening to. He had known women who deferred and women who performed, and Nora did neither. She simply engaged, directly and honestly, and it made him feel more like himself than he had in a long time. There was an evening in mid-May when Perry had stayed in town late for a meeting at the stockyards that ran long, and afterward he found himself walking toward the hotel rather than toward the livery where his horse was waiting. The evening was soft and warm, with the kind of blue Kansas sky that turns the color of deep water just before the stars come out. Nora was sitting on the hotel porch, which she had taken to doing in the evenings when the kitchen work was done and the accounts were behind her. She had a small book open on her knee and a glass of lemonade, and she was watching the street with a comfortable attentiveness, the way a person looks at something they have decided to call home. He sat down in the adjacent chair without asking, which he had not done before, and she shifted her book to her lap and said nothing for a moment, and the silence was the easy kind. "You seem settled," he said. "I am beginning to feel settled," she agreed. "Caldwell is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Frances's letters were vivid. She made it sound lawless and thrilling and also somehow homey. "It is all of those things at once which I did not quite believe until I saw it." She paused. She was right about it. Perry thought about Frances Dutton, who had been a cheerful, red-haired woman who had died of the fever in February, which had taken 3 other residents of the town as well. He had not known her well, but had known her enough to understand that she had been the sort of person who brightened any room she walked into. "She was a good person," he said. "The best," Nora said quietly. Then, after a moment, "I think she would have liked you." He looked at her. The blue evening light was making everything soft, and she met his gaze without flinching, which she always did, and the moment extended itself a beat longer than it strictly needed to. "I like to think so," he said. In the first week of June, Tom Ellery asked Nora if she would be willing to take on additional bookkeeping for 2 other Caldwell merchants, the hardware store owner and the saddle maker, both of whom had heard about her work through Tom's enthusiastic reports. She agreed, negotiated fair rates for both, and within a week she had moved out of the hotel and into a small 2-room house on the west side of town that she was renting from a widow named Mrs. Cade, who had moved in with her daughter and son-in-law and was glad to have the house occupied. The house was modest and needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 places, the kitchen window latch was broken, and the back fence had lost most of its posts to a winter storm. Perry found out about these deficiencies from Caleb, who found out from Mrs. Patterson, who found out from Mrs. Cade, who had mentioned them apologetically to Nora. He showed up on a Saturday morning in early June with a bag of tools and several replacement boards, and the kind of casual manner of a man who has thought carefully about the speech he will make, and has decided the best strategy is to have no speech at all. Nora answered the door with flour on her hands and the expression of a person who had been interrupted mid-task. She looked at the tools and then at him. "You were going to ask me if I wanted help," she said. "I was going to offer it," he said. "You can refuse." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Coffee is on," she said. They spent the morning working in a companionable way that felt entirely natural and slightly astonishing. Perry replaced the porch boards while Nora worked inside, and then he mended the kitchen window latch while she made cornbread, and then they both worked on the fence together, Nora holding posts while Perry drove them, working well together in the wordless coordination of 2 people who have somehow learned each other's rhythms without explicitly meaning to. Over lunch at her small kitchen table, a simple meal of cornbread and beans she had put on that morning, Perry asked her something he had been turning over for a while. "You said you sold everything in Wichita," he said. "What did you have there?" Nora cut her cornbread. "A room in a boarding house, a small collection of books, a decent horse." She glanced up. "Not much, to be honest. My life in Wichita was functional rather than rooted. I worked and I lived quietly, and I corresponded with Frances and waited for the moment when I could make it out here." She was quiet for a moment. "I was supposed to arrive last autumn, but I could not save the fare in time. And then Frances's letters stopped coming, and I wrote 3 times before I received a letter from her neighbor telling me about the fever." Her voice stayed steady, but her hands stilled on the table for just a moment. "I came anyway, because she had been right about it being a place where a person could build something. And because I had nowhere else that felt more like the right direction." Perry was quiet for a moment, watching her. The kitchen light was bright and honest, and she sat in it without pretense, this woman who had navigated grief and hardship and a bullet wound and 2 road agents and an entire new life with the same even-handed composure. He felt something in his chest that he was no longer pretending was anything other than what it was. "My father built this ranch," he said, "or the beginning of it. He came out from Tennessee in '64, and he homesteaded the land, and he built a house, and he ran cattle. And he was killed in '69 by a fever not unlike the one that took Francis. He had not talked about this in a long time. I was 19. I came west from Tennessee to take over the land because there was no one else to do it. I did not come because I chose it. I came because it needed doing. He looked at his hands. I have been here 9 years, and somewhere along the way I chose it, the land and the work and the life. But it was a slow choosing. I'm not sure I recognized it happening. Nora was looking at him with the full attention she gave everything. "And now?" she asked. "And now," he said, and then stopped himself, because what he wanted to say was more than the conversation had quite set up space for. "Now I find that there are things I want that I did not know I was missing." Something in the air of the small kitchen became very still. Nora did not look away, and he did not either. Outside, a horse went past on the street, and a dog barked twice, and Caldwell went on being Caldwell, noisy and sun-baked and alive. "That is an honest thing to say," Nora said carefully. "I generally try to be honest," he said. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her cornbread again and said, in a tone that was lighter but not dismissive, "Then let me be honest too. I came here with nothing, and I am building something, and I am doing it on my own terms because that matters to me. I want you to know that before whatever this is becomes more than two people eating cornbread in a kitchen." "I would not want it any other way," Perry said, and he meant it fully. The summer of 1878 in Caldwell, Kansas, was hot and busy and alive with the noise of cattle drives coming up from Texas on the Kishom Trail. Caldwell sat at the border, and in summer the town filled with cowboys and cattle buyers and the entire churning commerce of the beef trade, which brought money and danger in equal measure. Nora's bookkeeping work expanded further, because two of the cattle buyers who came through town asked Tom Ellery to recommend someone to help them reconcile their purchase records, and Tom sent them to Nora, and Nora charged them a fair rate and delivered accurate work, and word of this spread in the way that good practical work always spreads in a small community, quietly and effectively. Perry was busy through June and July with his own cattle operation. He and Caleb were preparing a herd of 300 head for the fall drive to Abilene, which meant long days in the saddle and evening work with the ledgers and negotiations with the buyer, a firm man from Chicago named Hawthorne, who was exacting about weight and quality. Perry was good at this work, and he knew it. He was patient with the animals in a way that other ranchers remarked on, and he had a talent for reading the land and the weather and the market that had made the Trask Ranch a solid, growing operation in 9 years. But in the evenings, when the work was done and Caleb was asleep, and the prairie was full of crickets and the particular warm dark of a Kansas summer night, Perry thought about Nora. He thought about the things she said, and the way she listened, and the line of her profile in the kitchen light, and the steady, self-possessed way she moved through the world. He had not been in love before, not truly, though he had been fond of a woman in Abilene 3 years ago and had thought briefly about marriage before she married a railroad man and went east. What he felt for Nora was different in kind, not in degree. It was quieter and deeper and more certain. He went to town every week, sometimes twice. He brought her things he told himself were practical and useful: a new latch for the back gate, a bag of coffee beans, a small wooden box he built in the evenings for her account books, which she had been storing in a straw basket. She accepted each thing without excess gratitude or false modesty, examined it with genuine interest, and reciprocated in ways that were equally practical. She mended the fraying collar of his good shirt when he mentioned he had been putting it off. She lent him a slim volume on accounting principles that she said might be useful for understanding Caleb's projections. She made him dinner twice, simple, honest meals that tasted better than most of what he had eaten in years. The neighbors noticed. In a town of Caldwell's size in 1878, private feelings had a shelf life measured in days. Mrs. Patterson made certain remarks. Tom Ellery made broader ones. Caleb Dunn made none, which meant he had noticed everything. One evening in late July, Perry and Nora walked together after dinner along the edge of town, where the street dissolved into open prairie, and the sky was enormous and rust-colored above the flat horizon. They had been talking about the fall cattle sale, about the prices Hawthorne had offered and Perry's counterargument, and Nora had offered a clear-eyed analysis of the situation that had sharpened his thinking on several points. They stopped at the edge of a low rise where the town fell away behind them, and the prairie spread out in every direction, vast and breathing in the evening wind, the grass moving in slow waves. "I never saw anything like this in Missouri," Nora said. "I never quite believed it was real until I stood in it." "It gets under your skin," Perry said. "The bigness of it. After a while you cannot imagine being closed in by hills." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the horizon. "I want to stay," she said simply, not to him exactly, more to herself and the prairie both. "I want to build something here that is mine, something permanent." "What would that look like?" he asked. She turned to him. In the rust-colored evening light she was vivid and real and very close. "A house," she said. "A proper one, not a rental, and work that is my own. I have been thinking about setting up formally as a bookkeeper. A single office, perhaps, where merchants and cattle buyers can bring their accounts to me." She paused. "I know women do not usually do this here." "Some do," Perry said. "And the ones who do it well are respected for it. I intend to do it well." "I know you do," he said, and the simplicity of his certainty made her look at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something open and slightly startled, as though she had expected to have to argue for it. "You never doubt that I can do things," she said. "I have never seen you fail to do a thing you set your mind to," he said. "So why would I doubt it?" She was looking at him directly, the way she always did, but there was something new in it, something searching. "Perry," she said. "Yes. I believe I may be developing feelings for you that go beyond friendship." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass and the sky was deepening toward true dark. "I have had those feelings for some time now," he said carefully. "I did not say it because I did not want to rush you." "I do not like to be rushed," she agreed. "But I also do not like to be unclear when I know my own mind, and I know it now." A small, real smile crossed her face, the full version of the almost smile he had been watching for 2 months. "I am telling you that I am interested in you, Perry Trask. If you would like to court me properly, I am open to that." He felt something in his chest loosen and settle at the same time, like a knot that has been worked free. "I would like nothing better," he said. She nodded, as though a practical matter had been settled, but her eyes were warm with something that had nothing practical about it at all. He offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked back toward town through the blue-dark Kansas evening with the first easy certainty of two people who have found each other and admitted it. The courtship, as Caldwell understood such things in 1878, was conducted with a mixture of proper form and genuine feeling that the town found it impossible not to approve of. Perry called on Nora 2 evenings a week and on Sunday afternoons. He brought flowers once, Texas bluebonnets that he had found growing along the creek on his south pasture, and she put them in a glass on her kitchen windowsill, and he noticed them there every time he came by after that. They went to church together on Sundays, which in Caldwell in 1878 was as clear a public statement as any formal announcement. Mrs. Patterson beamed. Tom Ellery told Perry he had better not let that woman get away, which Perry thought was both unnecessary and accurate. In late August, Caleb Dunn met Nora properly for the first time at a dinner Perry arranged at the ranch. It was a simple occasion, a meal in the ranch house that Perry had cleaned carefully and Nora had helped with, laughing at his attempts to arrange the tablecloth, which was slightly too small for the table and kept sliding. Caleb was quiet through most of the dinner, watching Nora with the assessment of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, which included looking after the interests of a young man he had come to think of as close to a son. At the end of the meal he said, "You have strong opinions about cattle prices." Nora had been discussing the fall market with Perry and had indeed expressed clear views. I have opinions supported by arithmetic, she said. The arithmetic is usually reliable. Caleb was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Perry could use someone like that. I could use someone like Perry, Nora said, simply and directly, and Caleb looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once, the deep nod of a man who has made a final decision about something and is at peace with it. Walking back to town that evening, Nora said, I think he approved. He did, Perry said. Caleb is sparing with his approval. When he gives it, it means something. She was quiet for a moment, walking close to him in the warm dark. My parents would have liked you, she said, and there was a quiet weight to it, the slight sorrow of sharing something with someone who would never meet the people who made you. My father would have liked that you are direct. My mother would have liked your hands. My hands. She said you could tell everything about a man's character from his hands, whether they are careful hands or careless ones. She glanced at him. Yours are careful hands. He took her hand then, carefully, and she laced her fingers through his, and they walked the rest of the way to town like that, not talking, just walking in the warm, late summer dark with the sound of the prairie around them. September brought the cattle drive to Abilene, and Perry was gone for 3 weeks. He had made arrangements before he left. He had asked Tom Ellery to keep an eye out for Nora, not because she needed looking after, but because the town could be rough at the end of summer, with the last of the trail herds coming through, and he wanted someone he trusted nearby. Tom took this responsibility with the seriousness of a man who had adopted Nora as something between an employee and a daughter. Nora, for her part, used the 3 weeks to move forward on her plan for a proper bookkeeping office. She had saved carefully through the summer and had spoken to a property owner named Garrett, who had a small room above the hardware store that he was willing to rent at reasonable rates. She signed the rental agreement on the 1st of September and spent the weeks of Perry's absence painting the walls a clean white, moving in a desk and 2 chairs that she found at the second-hand goods dealer, and lettering the window in careful paint. Nora Rhodes, Accounts and Bookkeeping. When Perry rode back into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in late September, leaner and dusted from the trail, and carrying the very satisfying weight of the Abilene sale in his saddle bags, the first thing he saw when he turned onto the main street was her sign in the window above the hardware store. He pulled up his horse and looked at it for a long moment, and felt proud in a way that was entirely about her and entirely unselfish. He found her in the office, at the desk, working. She looked up when he came in, and her face did something that she might have tried to control but did not quite manage, a full and unguarded brightness that she then settled into the more usual composed expression, but not before he had seen it. How was Abilene? She asked. Profitable. He set his hat on the chair and looked at the office, the clean walls and the careful desk and the lettered window. This is remarkable, he said. It needs a second chair for clients, she said, and I should like a small bookshelf on the east wall, but it is a beginning. It is more than a beginning, he said. He looked at her. 3 weeks was a long time when you were not used to counting time differently, and looking at her now he understood that he had been counting it from the moment he left. I have something to ask you, he said, and I had planned to ask it more carefully with more preparation, but I find that I am not willing to wait the time it would take to prepare properly. Nora set down her pen. She looked at him steadily with those clear green eyes. Then ask it, she said. I would like to marry you, Perry said. I have wanted to ask you for the better part of 2 months. I did not want to rush you, and I did not want to speak before I was certain, but I am entirely certain, and I think perhaps you are too, and I am asking now. He paused. Will you marry me, Nora Rhodes? The office was very quiet. Outside the window the sounds of Caldwell went on, wagons and voices and the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards. Nora was still for a long moment, and he could see her working through it, the methodical, thorough way she considered everything, which he loved because it meant that when she said yes, it would be a yes that she had fully meant. She looked at her hands on the desk. Then she looked at him. I have 3 conditions, she said. His mouth curved slightly. Name them. My bookkeeping work is mine. It continues after marriage, and you do not have authority over the income from it. Agreed. The house we live in, whether it is the ranch house or otherwise, I will have full say in the arrangement of it." "Agreed readily," he said. "And thirdly," she paused, and something softer moved through her expression, "you must always be honest with me as you have been. Even when honesty is uncomfortable, I could not bear dishonesty from you." "That one I can give without any reservation at all," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Yes, Perry Trask, I will marry you." He crossed the small office in 2 steps, and she stood to meet him, and he held her face between his careful hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back with the same directness she gave to everything. And the Kansas afternoon light fell golden through the lettered window and made the whole small room luminous. They were married on the 14th of October, 1878, in the Caldwell church, which was a modest building with whitewashed walls and wooden pews that the congregation kept scrupulously clean. The preacher was a man named Reverend Cross, who was known for keeping his sermons short and his convictions genuine, which both Perry and Nora approved of. Caleb Dunn stood beside Perry as his witness. Mrs. Patterson, who wept openly from the 3rd pew, had helped Nora alter a gown of deep cream-colored cotton that had been Mrs. Patterson's own daughter's, and which she had offered with a warmth that made Nora, who had been navigating the occasion without any family of her own, feel less alone in the world. Tom Ellery attended with his wife, a small, energetic woman named Lottie, who had brought a crock of pickled peaches as a wedding gift, which was an Ellery family tradition. Most of the town came, which was simply the way of things in a small western town in 1878, where a wedding was a community event, and everyone felt they had a right to attend. Nora walked down the short aisle alone because there was no one to walk her, and Perry watched her come and thought that there was something right about it, that she walked to him on her own 2 feet because she was a woman who did everything on her own 2 feet, and he would not have wanted anything different. The ceremony was brief and real, and when Reverend Cross asked Perry if he would take this woman, Perry said, "I will," with a conviction that carried to the back of the room, and when he asked Nora, she said, "I will," in her clear, direct voice, and the congregation made a sound of collective satisfaction. Outside afterward in the October sunshine, warm and bright in the way of Kansas autumns before the first cold comes, Nora stood with her hand in Perry's and received the congratulations of the town and felt, for the first time since she had ridden into Caldwell bleeding and alone in the spring, that she was somewhere she was meant to be. The ranch house needed work. Nora had known this because Perry had said so, but saying so and seeing it were different things. It was a solid structure, built by Perry's father in the mid-1860s with good timber and honest intention, but it had been a bachelor's house for 9 years and showed it. The main room was functional but bare, the kitchen was dark, and the 2 bedrooms had the minimal furnishings of a man who slept there rather than lived there. Nora set about changing this with the same systematic focus she brought to account books. She did not try to do everything at once. She made a list, which Perry read over her shoulder one evening and which made him laugh quietly, not at it but with it, at the pleasure of seeing her mind laid out on paper in numbered points. They worked on it together over that autumn and winter. Perry built a proper kitchen shelf and a broader table and a second rocking chair for the porch. Nora hung curtains that let the light through and brought warmth to the rooms, and she arranged the space with a sensible eye that made the house, almost overnight, feel lived in and intentional. She moved her bookkeeping practice out to the ranch for the winter months, working at the kitchen table with the window facing the south pasture, and in those quiet mornings with the winter prairie white and clean outside and the smell of coffee in the warm kitchen, something settled deep and permanently into place. Perry was an attentive husband in the way that Nora had hoped for but had not entirely counted on. He was interested in her work and her opinions and her interior life in a way that felt natural rather than effortful, as though he simply found her genuinely interesting and saw no reason not to act accordingly. He told her things about the ranch and the cattle and his plans, not because she needed to approve them, but because he wanted her perspective, and her perspective was usually useful. He was careful with her in the ways that mattered and unceremonious in the ways that would have felt suffocating. And she found herself, in the quiet of an ordinary winter evening, with a fire and a book and Perry reading beside her, experiencing a happiness so steady and certain that it almost frightened her with its solidity. "What are you thinking?" he asked one evening, looking up and finding her watching him. "I am thinking that I did not know it could be like this," she said. He set his book down. "Like what?" "Quiet," she said. "I thought love would feel more like storms. That is what the books suggest. But this feels more like coming in from cold weather, warm and steady and reliable." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am glad," he said, and the simplicity of it was exactly right. In January of 1879, news came through town of something that troubled the community in ways that went beyond ordinary local concerns. A group of Cheyenne families, displaced from the land that had been their own, had been seen moving north through the region, and the army had sent riders into Caldwell asking about their movements. Nora heard about this at Tom Ellery's store one morning when two of the cattle buyers were discussing it with the kind of casual callousness that made her jaw tighten. She brought it up with Perry that evening. He was quiet for a while, then said, "This land was theirs before any of us came. Every homestead out here, mine included, sits on ground that belonged to the Cheyenne and the Comanche and others before any treaties were drawn and redrawn to push them off it." He said it plainly, without false comfort or defensive justification. "I do not know what the right answer is, but I know the history is not clean." Nora respected him for saying it without equivocation. "The army acts as though the people are simply obstacles," she said. "To some men they are," Perry said. "It is one of the great wrongs of this time, and pretending otherwise does not help anyone." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. These were the conversations she had not expected, the ones where the world outside the ranch came in and they faced it together with honesty, and it bound them more closely than any easier exchange could have. Spring came early to the Kansas plains in 1879, warm and green by the 1st of April, with the creek on the south pasture running fast and clear with snowmelt from the north. Nora had resumed her trips into Caldwell 3 mornings a week for her bookkeeping work, and the practice had grown steadily. She now kept accounts for 6 local businesses and 2 regular cattle buyers, and her reputation had reached the nearby town of Wellington, from which one merchant had ridden the 15 miles to Caldwell specifically to hire her. She had declined only because the distance was impractical, but she had given him a thorough consultation and recommended a method for organizing his own accounts that he could apply himself, and he had left satisfied and had sent her a box of good tea as payment, which she had found both charming and adequate. In April she told Perry she was expecting their first child, one morning at the kitchen table with the spring light coming through the window she had fitted with new curtains of pale yellow. Perry sat very still for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands, not in distress, but in the overwhelmed way of a man who has been caught unprepared by joy. When he looked up his eyes were bright. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said, with the composure of a woman who had been sitting with the knowledge for 2 weeks and had decided how she felt about it. "I am happy," she added, because she wanted him to know. He came around the table and she stood and he held her with the careful strength she had come to know as his, and outside the spring prairie was new and green and the cattle were calling across the pasture. "I am terrified," he said into her hair. "That seems reasonable," she said. "So am I," he laughed, which made her laugh, and they stayed like that for a long time in the bright April kitchen. Caleb, when told, shook Perry's hand for much longer than was strictly necessary, and then went very quiet and looked out at the pasture for a while. And Perry understood that Caleb was thinking about his own children, who had been born and lost in ways that life in the West had a way of demanding, and he left the old man to his thoughts. The months of the pregnancy moved through the landscape of their lives with the ordinary, extraordinary texture of such times. Nora worked until late July, when the heat and the additional weight made the trips into town uncomfortable, and then she arranged for Tom Ellery to bring accounts out to the ranch twice a week, which Tom did with great willingness, and the additional bonus of bringing Lottie, who became Nora's most reliable companion during those last heavy months of summer, full of opinions about childbirth and practical advice that was often blunt and always useful. The baby came on the 1st of November, 1879, on a cold and clear day with frost on the grass and wood smoke rising straight and white in the still air. It was a difficult labor that lasted most of a day, and Perry, who had been sent out of the room by the midwife, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Bowen, spent 6 hours doing useless tasks in the barn, and then sitting on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees, listening to the sounds from inside the house with an expression that Caleb, who sat beside him for most of it, recognized as the particular anguish of a man who loves someone and can do nothing to help them. When Mrs. Bowen opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Trask, and your wife is well," Perry stood up so fast he knocked his hat off and did not notice. The boy was healthy and loud and had a cap of dark hair and eyes that could not yet be read for color. Nora lay in the cleaned and freshened room looking exhausted and luminous in equal measure, holding the wrapped baby against her chest, and when Perry came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them together, he could not speak for a moment. "He looks like you," Nora said. "He looks like a red potato," Perry said honestly, and Nora laughed, which turned into a wince and then back into a laugh, and Mrs. Bowen, moving efficiently about the room, made a sound that was almost a smile. They named him Thomas James Trask, Thomas for Tom Ellery, who had been a consistent and genuine friend, and James for Nora's father, who had been a good man and deserved remembering. Tom Ellery, when told his name had been used, sat down abruptly on the nearest chair and put his hands over his face in a way that Lottie found extremely satisfying, and which prompted her to squeeze Nora's hands very hard and say, "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever done for that man." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a good winter, the way some winters are, cold but not brutal, with enough snow to promise water in the spring, and enough clear days to get outside and see the land bright and white under the blue sky. Thomas James Trask, known almost immediately as Tommy, was a serious baby who observed his world with an attention that reminded everyone of his mother. He slept relatively well for a newborn and ate with enthusiasm, and had strong opinions about what he wanted, which he communicated with a directness that Perry said was also entirely his mother. Nora resumed her bookkeeping work by February, working from the kitchen table with Tommy in a wooden cradle that Perry had built over the long evenings of autumn, the rockers precisely balanced so that a nudge from one foot kept it moving while both hands stayed free for writing. She found the rhythm of work and motherhood demanding and also deeply satisfying, and the fact that her husband never once suggested she ought to choose between the two meant that she never had to spend energy defending a decision she had already made. The spring of 1880 brought the full thrust of another cattle season, and with it, a new complication. A man named Reeves, who had come down from Kansas City with capital and plans, was attempting to buy up land south of Caldwell at prices that were low enough to constitute either sharp dealing or outright coercion, depending on which homesteader you asked. Two of Perry's neighbors came to him in March asking for advice, and Perry went to Caleb, and between the three of them they worked out that Reeves was banking on the smaller homesteaders being unable to hold out through a bad market season. "He's not doing anything outright illegal," Caleb said, studying the papers one of the neighbors had brought, "but he's counting on desperation." "Then we counteract desperation," Perry said. "We organize the neighbors. We present a united front to the cattle buyers this fall. We don't sell individually when we can sell collectively and get a better price." Nora, sitting at the kitchen table with Tommy on her knee and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, said, "You should also look at the land titles. In my experience, when someone is operating from legal gray areas, The documentation is often thin. She looked at Perry. I can help with that if you bring me the relevant papers. Caleb looked at her with the expression he reserved for people who said useful things. What would we be looking for? He asked. Discrepancies between what Reeves is offering as terms and what the actual contracts specify. Also whether his right to make the offers he's making is properly established. She shifted Tommy to her other knee. Contracts are a form of accounting. They have the same vulnerability to error and manipulation. What followed was 3 weeks of Nora going through documents at the kitchen table in the evenings after Tommy was down, finding exactly 3 instances where Reeves's documentation was either incomplete or inconsistent with Kansas territorial land law. She set out her findings in a clear, organized report that Perry took to the county clerk in Wellington, and the clerk, who was a conscientious man, took the report to the county judge, and Reeves's land-buying operation was quietly but firmly halted while the matters were investigated. Reeves did not stay in the region. He moved on to other opportunities, which was how such men operated. The neighbors were safe. Tom Ellery, who heard about the whole affair eventually, said, "Perry Trask, that woman of yours is worth 10 of most men I know," and Perry said, "I am aware." When he told Nora what Tom had said, she raised an eyebrow. "He could have said worth 10 of most people," she said. "He's working on it," Perry said. For Tom, that was progress. She conceded the point. The summer of 1880 was golden and full. Tommy learned to walk in June at 8 months, which was early enough that Mrs. Patterson declared him a prodigy, and which Perry observed with the particular mixture of pride and slight alarm that a father feels when his child begins to demonstrate an independent ability to get into trouble. By August, he was covering distance at speed and had opinions about the chickens, and had developed a passionate devotion to Caleb, whom he followed around the yard with concentrated purpose whenever Caleb was at the ranch house. Caleb, who had lost his own children and had lived alone for many years, navigated this devotion with a gruff tenderness that fooled no one. He whittled Tommy a small wooden horse, which Tommy called Horsey with the incisive vocabulary of a 9-month-old, and carried everywhere. He taught Tommy to count the chickens, which Tommy did incorrectly but enthusiastically. He sat on the porch with the boy on his knee in the evenings, and told him things in a low voice that Perry and Nora could not quite hear from the kitchen, but which made Tommy laugh with the whole-body laughter of babies who have not yet learned to modulate joy. In September, Caleb came to Perry and Nora together one evening after Tommy was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table and turned his coffee cup in his hands and said, "I've been thinking about making a change." Perry waited. "I've got a sister in Galveston," Caleb said. "She's a widow and she's written to ask if I'd come. She's not well and her son is not reliable and she needs someone." He looked up. "I've been putting off the decision for 6 months because it meant leaving, and I did not want to leave before I was sure things were right here." "Things are right here," Perry said. "They are," Caleb agreed. He looked at both of them. "You two are what right looks like. This ranch is solid and the accounts are sound, and there is a woman here who knows the business as well as I do, better in some specifics." He nodded at Nora. "I can go and feel easy about it." Nora reached across the table and put her hand over Caleb's old weathered one. "Your sister needs you," she said, "and you should go." He looked at her for a moment. "You are a good woman, Nora Trask," he said. "I try to be," she said. Caleb left for Galveston in October on a dry and bright fall day. Perry drove him to the stage in Caldwell and they shook hands for a long time at the stage door, and Perry said, "Right," and Caleb said, "You know I'm not a writer," and Perry said, "Try," and Caleb said, "Don't let the boy near the east pasture fence until it's repaired," and Perry said, "I know," and then the stage driver called and Caleb climbed up and was gone. Perry stood in the Caldwell Street for a while after the stage rolled out. Then he walked to Nora's office where she was working, and she looked up when he came in and read his face and stood up and came to him, and he held on to her in the small, clean office with the afternoon light coming through the lettered window, and she led him quietly until the feeling had settled. "He'll be all right," she said. "I know," he said. "It's just the change of a shape. You get used to someone being part of the landscape." "He'll write," she said. "He said he wouldn't." "He'll write," she said, with the certainty of a woman who has assessed all available evidence and reached a conclusion. She was right. The first letter from Galveston arrived 5 weeks later, 2 pages of Caleb's large, careful handwriting full of observations about his sister's house and the sea air, and a remark at the end about a woman at his sister's church named Dolers who was a fine cook and had a laugh like a meadowlark. Perry read that last part to Nora, and Nora said with a small smile, "Well then," and Perry folded the letter with great satisfaction. By the time Tommy was 2 years old, in the autumn of 1881, the Trask ranch had grown. Perry had hired 2 hands, brothers named Sam and Will Garrett, who were reliable and good with cattle, and who had the decency to show respect to Nora without being asked, which Perry had made clear in the hiring conversation was a condition of employment. The herd had increased to nearly 500 head, and the fall sales had been strong 2 years running. Nora's bookkeeping practice now employed a part-time assistant, a young woman named Clara Webb who was 17 and willing and learning fast, whom Nora was teaching with the same patient directness she brought to everything. They had repaired and expanded the ranch house, adding a second bedroom for Tommy and a proper study for Nora with bookshelves on 3 walls and a window that looked out at the south pasture. She kept books there, real books, a collection she had been building since Wichita and expanding steadily, and on winter evenings the study was warm and lamplit and full of the particular satisfaction of a room that is exactly what its occupant needs it to be. It was in that study, on a January evening in 1882, that Nora told Perry she was expecting their second child. He looked up from the chair where he had been reading, and she was standing in the doorway of the study with a lamp in her hand and an expression that was pleased and slightly mischievous, and he knew before she said it. "Again?" he said. "Again," she agreed. He set his book down very carefully on the side table, in the deliberate way of a man managing an excess of feeling, and she came into the room and set the lamp on the shelf and sat on the arm of his chair, which she had taken to doing because it was easier than fetching another chair. He put his arm around her. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm happy," she said. "Are you?" "Nora," he said, with a warmth and simplicity that said everything. The second child arrived in August of 1882, a girl this time, small and fierce with her mother's green eyes from nearly the beginning, which was unusual enough that Doc Harlan remarked on it. They named her Frances Eleanor, Frances for the cousin whose letters had called Nora west to the life she was living now, and Eleanor for Perry's mother, whom he had loved and missed for 13 years. Frances Eleanor Trask, known immediately as Ellie, came into the world screaming, which Mrs. Bowen said was a very good sign, and did not stop being loud and opinionated for the entire first year of her life, which made Tommy, who was now a solemn and watchful 3-year-old, regard her with the polite wariness of a person encountering a natural phenomenon of unpredictable force. Perry adored her completely. He had not known whether he would feel differently about a daughter than a son, and the answer was that he felt the same enormous protective tenderness toward her that he felt toward Tommy, and also a specific, helpless delight in her that had something to do with the green eyes that were her mother's, and the way she already, at 4 months, observed the world with focused attention, as though she was taking notes. Nora nursed and worked in the same weeks, the same manageable overlap of demands that she had navigated with Tommy, with the difference that Clara Webb was now fully competent to handle the routine accounts under Nora's direction, which freed Nora for the more complex work and the new clients who came to her with increasingly complicated situations. In 1882, a significant addition to Caldwell's commercial life arrived in the form of a new bank, the Caldwell Savings Bank, established by a consortium from Kansas City. The bank's local manager, a careful and formal man named Mr. Aldrich asked Tom Ellery for a recommendation for bookkeeping assistance, and Tom sent him to Nora, and Nora negotiated a contract with the bank that was the largest single professional arrangement of her career to date. It involved reviewing and organizing the bank's initial account structures, a task that took 3 months and which she conducted from the ranch, riding into town 2 days a week with Clara Webb to meet with Mr. Aldrich and his staff. Mr. Aldrich, who had come with certain expectations about the kind of professional he would be dealing with, encountered Nora Rhodes Trask on the first day with a thoroughness and precision that rearranged those expectations quickly. By the second week he had stopped using the slightly condescending tone he had initially employed and was speaking to her as a professional equal, which was how she had intended it. Perry heard about this from Tom Ellery, who had heard it from Mr. Aldrich himself, and who told it with great relish. The life that had been built at the Trask Ranch and in Caldwell through those years had the quality of something made on purpose, not accidentally stumbled into, the way the best things are. It was not without difficulty. The West was not without difficulty, and Caldwell in the early 1880s still carried the particular rawness of a place where the law was new and not universally respected, where drought could devastate a season's work and a bad market could undo a careful year. They weathered these things together, the way you do when you have chosen a partner with both your heart and your head, and the choice has proved sound. In the spring of 1883, a letter came from Galveston. Caleb wrote to tell them that he had married the woman from his sister's church, the one named Dolers with the laugh like a meadowlark. He was 66 years old and she was 58, and his sister had stood for them at the ceremony, and declared it the most sensible event to happen in Galveston in years. He wrote that the sea air was good for his joints, and that Dolers made the finest tamales he had ever tasted, and that he thought about the ranch often, and hoped the east pasture fence had been properly repaired. Perry read the letter aloud at the kitchen table with Tommy on one side of him and Ellie, who was 8 months old and sitting independently in her high chair with a look of intense concentration, on the other. When he got to the part about Dolers, Nora put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and laughed with a fullness that turned her shoulders and made the children look at her with wide, interested eyes. "I told you he would write," she said. "You did," Perry said. He sent a return letter the same afternoon, and at the end of it in his careful handwriting he wrote, "Nora says you deserve every happiness. I agree with Nora as I usually do. The east fence is repaired and the ranch is good, and the children are healthy and everything here is as right as it can be. We miss you, Caleb. Come and see us when you can." The summer of 1883 was the third consecutive good year, with the grass lush and the herd strong, and the fall sale already shaping up well based on the first conversations with buyers in July. Tommy was a solid 3-year-old who had his father's hands and his mother's observational habits, and who had developed a specific interest in the cattle that Perry was carefully encouraging, not because he needed Tommy to be a rancher, but because it was good for a child to love something real and take it seriously. Ellie, at nearly a year, had discovered walking, which she conducted at full speed with very little adjustment for obstacles, and which resulted in a number of soft tumbles and exactly no crying, because Ellie Trask had her mother's constitution about pain and her father's stubbornness about being helped up. One August evening, after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet under a sky so full of stars it looked crowded, Perry and Nora sat together on the porch in the 2 rocking chairs he had built in that first winter. The prairie was soft and dark and alive with crickets and the distant sound of the creek. Nora had a letter she had been reading earlier, from a woman in Wellington who wanted bookkeeping advice about setting up a millinery business, the kind of small initiative that came to her regularly now, women trying to establish themselves commercially in the limited spaces the West allowed, and who found in Nora a combination of professional expertise and the particular understanding of a woman who had done something similar herself. She set the letter on her knee and looked out at the dark prairie. "What are you thinking?" Perry asked. "I was thinking about what Caldwell was when I rode in," she said. "The state of me, and what it is now." "What is it now?" She turned her head to look at him. In the starlight his face was familiar to her in the deep way that a landscape becomes familiar, not just recognized but known, the particular way a place that has been inhabited fully settles into the body. She had been afraid once that steady happiness was a lesser thing, that it lacked the pitch and drama of what the books described as love. She had been wrong about that, she understood now. The pitch and drama were there, they simply lived in a different register, in the way he said her name when he was not thinking about saying it, in the unhurried certainty of his hands, in the particular quality of a morning when they were both in the kitchen before the children woke and the day was still entirely theirs. The drama was in the depth of it, not the noise. "It is home," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she turned hers to fit with his the way it had learned to fit over years of this. And they sat together in the warm dark with the sound of the prairie and the children sleeping and the stars going on in every direction. And there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said, and nothing that needed to be resolved that had not been resolved. And the life that she had ridden into this town, with nothing to begin stretched out ahead of them in every direction, like the prairie itself, broad and real and full of seasons. Perry raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it slowly, without urgency, the way a man touches something he intends to keep. Nora looked at him with those clear green eyes and said, "Perry, yes, I am very glad I rode into Caldwell." He looked at her, this woman who had come to him bloody and unbowed and full of her own quiet fire, who had built a life and a home and a family with the same methodical, passionate care she brought to everything, who had made him feel more like himself in 5 years than he had felt in all the years before. He thought of the morning she had ridden in on the roan mare with her arm wrapped in blood-soaked bandage, and the way he had dropped the piece of straw and walked toward her without deciding to. "So am I," he said, "every day." In the years that followed, Caldwell continued to change, as the West was always changing in those decades when the cattle trails shaped the country and towns either found their footing or faded. The Trask Ranch grew to 700 head by 1885 and had a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far as Chicago. Nora's bookkeeping practice, which she had moved from the small office above the hardware store to a properly fitted set of 2 rooms on the main street in 1884, employed Clara Webb full-time and a second assistant, a young man named Robert Hayes, and served businesses across 3 counties. She had also, by 1885, become an informal resource for women in the region who were attempting to establish independent commercial lives, advising and sometimes lending professional support to millinery shops and dressmakers and boarding houses in a radius of 50 miles. This was not a formal arrangement, and she charged nothing for it, but it built a network of women who referred other women and clients to her and to each other, and which was, in its quiet way, one of the things she was most proud of. Tommy started school in the fall of 1884 at 5 years old, and applied himself to reading with the same early seriousness he applied to watching cattle. He had his father's gift for the land and his mother's for figures, and his teacher, a young man newly arrived from Ohio named Mr. Brent, told Perry in the spring that Tommy was the kind of student that made the job worth doing. Ellie, at 3 in 1885, was the center of every room she entered, not because she demanded it, though she had that capacity, but because she was genuinely electric, full of curiosity and loud opinions, and a laugh that started in her belly and arrived with full force. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair and the combined stubbornness of both parents, which promised an interesting adolescence. In the autumn of 1885, on a Sunday afternoon with the prairie gold and brown under the October sky, and a light cold wind coming down from the north, Perry and Nora were riding together along the South Creek, which had become a Sunday habit when the season permitted, and the children were with Sam and Will at the barn, where Tommy was having a patient lesson in how to properly halter a horse, and Ellie was mostly getting underfoot and commenting on the proceedings. They rode in a companionable quiet, the horses walking easy on the creek bank, and Nora was thinking about the letter she needed to write to the Wellington woman about the final account structures, and Perry was thinking about the winter hay supply, and whether they needed to bring in more before the first hard freeze. And these ordinary thoughts ran alongside each other in the easy parallel of two people who have shared a life long enough to move through the world in the same current. Nora pulled up at the bend of the creek where there was an old cottonwood whose roots had grown down into the bank, large and gnarled and permanent. She had always liked this tree. It had been here before her and would be here long after, which was a thought she found comforting rather than diminishing. "Perry," she said. He pulled up beside her. The creek was low in autumn, running clear over smooth stones, making the soft sound of water in shallow places. "There is something I want to say to you," she said. He looked at her. She was 42 years old now, she would tell him in December, and she was not young in the way of those first mornings in Caldwell, but she was vivid and solid and more fully herself than ever, and he loved her with the practiced depth of 7 years of knowing. "I have been thinking about Frances," Nora said. "About how she wrote to me every month and described this place and told me to come. She could not have known what she was sending me to. She could not have known about you or this ranch or any of it. She just knew that it was a place where something real could be built, and she wanted that for me." She looked out at the creek and the cottonwood and the October prairie spreading away to the horizon. "I want to have a third child," she said. He was quiet. "I know it is not a small thing to say at 42, she said, with the directness she had never abandoned. "I have thought about it carefully. I have spoken with Doc Harlan. He says it is manageable if I am careful and if the pregnancy proceeds well." "And what do you want?" Perry said. She turned to look at him. "I want it," she said. "I want this life to be bigger. I want more of it." He looked at her for a long moment in the October light, this woman who had never stopped astonishing him with the quality of her aliveness, the way she met the world. "Then we shall have more of it," he said. Their third child, a boy, was born in July of 1886, on a hot and golden morning with the summer prairie at full green height outside the bedroom windows. He came safely and without excessive difficulty, which Doc Harlan, who had been present at all 3 Trask births, said was a testament to Nora's constitution. They named him Caleb James, for the old man in Galveston and for Nora's father, whose name deserved a second use. When the letter reached Galveston, Caleb Dunn wrote back within a week, which was the fastest response he had ever managed, and the letter was the most personal thing he had ever written, full of the emotion he generally withheld from ordinary correspondence. He wrote that he was deeply honored and that Dolers had cried, which Caleb conveyed as a separate fact about Dolers rather than an expression of his own feelings, though the two were obviously connected. He wrote that he hoped to come north to see the ranch before too much more time passed, and that his joints would permit the journey if the season was right. He came the following spring, in April of 1887, arriving by stage into Caldwell on a mild and windy day with Dolers on his arm, a small, warm-eyed woman of 62 with silver-streaked dark hair, and the manner of someone who had decided long ago to find the world fundamentally pleasant, and had been largely successful in this project. Tommy was 8 years old and received Caleb with a formal handshake and a seriousness that made Caleb's eyes go very bright. Ellie, who was 5, launched herself at Caleb from the porch step before he had cleared the gate, and he caught her with the practiced reflex of a man who had been ready for this, and held on with an expression that was pure and complete joy. Baby Caleb James, at 10 months, regarded his namesake from the safety of Nora's arms with the focused assessment of someone taking inventory. They had a week together, the old man and his wife, and the family that had grown out of a cattle ranch, and a woman who had ridden in from nowhere and built something real. There were dinners at the long kitchen table and walks along the South Creek, and an afternoon when Caleb and Tommy went out to look at the cattle together, with Tommy explaining the herd's qualities in detailed terms, and Caleb listening with the absolute attention he gave to children who were being serious. There was an evening on the porch with the prairie dark, and the stars overhead and dolors, and Nora talking together, in the warm, easy way of women who have each found what they needed in life and feel no competition about it. On the last night of the visit, after the children were in bed and dolors had gone in, Caleb and Perry sat on the porch together with coffee going cold between them, the way they had sat on many evenings years ago when the ranch was younger and simpler. "You did good," Caleb said. Perry looked at the dark pasture. "Nora did good." "You both did," Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was not sure when I left whether I was right to go. I thought about it for a long time after." "You were right to go," Perry said. "Your sister needed you, and Dolores was waiting for you in Galveston." "She was," Caleb agreed, with a satisfaction so deep and calm it was almost visible. "She was." He finished his coffee. "You know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "That morning she rode in. You dropped that piece of straw and walked toward her, and I watched from the doorway and I thought, there goes a man who doesn't know what's happening to him yet." Perry smiled. "I had no idea, but you walked toward her anyway." "I walked toward her anyway." Caleb nodded slowly. "That is the whole of it, I think," he said. "You walk toward what calls you before you understand it. And then you understand it later, and by then you're already there." Perry looked at the lamplit window where Nora was visible briefly, moving through the kitchen, and the familiar ache of love that had nothing of pain in it ran through him warm and complete. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." Caleb and Dolores left the next morning for the stage back to Wellington, and then south to Galveston, and Tommy stood at the gate and watched until the wagon was out of sight, and Ellie waved from Perry's arms until her arm got tired, and baby Caleb James watched the road with those serious eyes and made a sound that might have been a word or might have been simply a sound, and nobody could be certain. Nora stood beside Perry at the gate after the children had gone back to the yard. She slipped her hand into his. "Good visit," she said. "Good visit," he agreed. She looked at him, and the spring morning was bright and warm, and the south pasture was green, and the cattle were moving slow and unhurried in the distance, and the ranch house behind them was solid and full of the life they had made, and Tommy's laugh came from the yard followed by Ellie's louder one, and baby Caleb made his serious inquiring sounds from somewhere near the porch. "Come on then," Nora said, and turned back toward the house. Perry followed her, through the gate and up the porch steps, and into the warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and the morning and everything they had built, and the door closed behind them on the April day, and the ranch went on being what it had become, alive and real and full, out in the great open country of the Kansas prairie, under the enormous and generous sky. Nora Rhodes had ridden into Caldwell with nothing and a wound and the unshakable intention to build something real. She had built it, piece by piece, in the way that the best things are built, with work and honesty and the willingness to walk toward what called to her. And Perry Trask, who had dropped a piece of straw one spring morning and walked across a dusty street without understanding why, had built it with her. They were, in the way of all the best love stories, exactly where they were supposed to be.